Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Friday's Focus on Finances. My name is Jamie Fleming, and today we're going to be talking about the 7 financial topics to discuss with your significant other. And I chose this topic today after reading an article in Inc. magazine about the 10 most common things long-term couples fight about at some point in the relationship. And so I thought it was apropos to bring this into our financial discussion today. I actually want to read you a little bit of the article that inspired today's topic. And it is after reading this, study after study shows that the 2 biggest things couples fight about are money and sex, right? And interestingly enough, number 1, if you can see my phone, is actually money. So more than not, money is the number 1 thing that couples fight about. And some of those things can be, does the kitchen really need to be renovated again? Are we going to send the kids to public school or a $15,000 a year private school? Did you really need to buy another scarf? What you want to spend money on and when reveals critical things about your values and priorities. And of course, if you've listened to me at all, we talk a lot about your values and talking about your values, talking about them to your significant other, to your kids, doing this as a family so that you can be on the same page. And I thought it was interesting as well that this was in Inc. magazine because, as you all know, I work with many business owners and entrepreneurs, and I attract those types of clients because I am one myself. So you add business owner of making decisions every single day. If you're a woman entrepreneur and you have a family and kids, you're making decisions at home. So you're constantly juggling all these different things. And one of the things that comes up more often than not when people come to my office, and this is over 30 years of talking to couples, is that couples don't talk about their finances. And sometimes that hour, that first hour they spend with me, is the most they've talked about finances together in their entire relationship. So knowing that financial conversations are one of the biggest stressors, I thought it would be a good topic to bring to you and to show you how to be proactive in your discussions, what to talk about, why it's important, and then go from there so that you can have a cohesive financial discussion together and have that translate into less stress when you talk about finances. I think what I see in my history in this industry is that people wait to talk about things and then they fester and then they get really big versus having a proactive approach, knowing what to do when certain things come up. So interestingly enough, the number one topic for today's 7 financial topics is really just your financial mistakes of the past. And the reality is, we've all made financial mistakes of some kind or another, maybe small, maybe big, but I usually refer to these as your financial tuition. Most of us did not grow up with a healthy financial foundation to learn from. We didn't learn in school. We didn't learn from our parents. We did a lot of winging it, hoping that we are on the right track. So the fact that people have financial mistakes is very stressful to a lot of people. And they'll come in and say, I'm embarrassed to share this with you, but this is what's happened in the past. And what I do immediately is let my clients know that however you got here is how you got here, but going forward, what we want to do is hopefully we learn from the mistakes. We're not repeating them. And if you're in a situation where you've made the same mistake over and over again, then it's time to look at help and talking things through. And when you can talk to your significant other about these mistakes, it's probably the hardest topic of all the topics that we're going to discuss today. But if you can actually allow yourself to share some of those financial mistakes with your person, then you can both learn, and maybe your significant other also has some experiences or maybe some successes in areas that you struggle. So talk about all your past financial mistakes, right? Because in addition to that, part of trust is having complete transparency about what's going on with your finances. And this is especially true with your life partner. And when you're discussing your finances, tell your partner everything that's relevant in your financial past so that you get it out in the open, right? Because we know this statement to be true. The cover up is usually worse than the crime, right? So don't make the mistake about lying or hiding information about your past, because one way or another, it usually comes out. And the longer you wait to have this particular discussion, the more it builds up, the more anxiety builds up. If you have embarrassment around it, that builds up. And the reality is that we just need to get through them, talk about them, and see how we can prevent from doing the same mistakes, financial mistakes in the future. So I always like to have these discussions with my clients because I want them to have a clean slate when they start working with me. And part of that is letting go of those past mistakes, right? Not letting them dictate how you make financial decisions in the future. Is what happens much of the time is if you've had some financial mistakes in the past, then there's an anxiety that you'll continue to do it rather than talk about it, find solutions for it, and then be proactive so that you have a game plan going forward. So the second topic that you want to talk about with your significant other is your current financial status, right? So that means talking about your current debts, whether you have credit card debts, student loans, personal loans. You want to look at your assets. Do you have a budget? Your credit score. People have a lot of anxiety about credit scores and what to do if your credit isn't as good as you'd like it to be, and anything else that's relevant. So knowing where you both stand financially is the first step in creating a plan for the future together. So if we know all the information, I always tell people you can make very solid changes and plans if you have all the information. I was actually just talking to someone the other day who is in commercial insurance and does a lot of planning for her clients. And we were talking about you can only do the best that you can do if you have all the information. And so if you don't have all the information, or if I don't have all the information, or your significant other doesn't have all the information, then you're making decisions and choices on half the facts. And that can be detrimental because you're assuming that some things to be true when they're not true. And so if you have credit card debt, yes, it sucks. And yes, it's hard to look at that and say, okay, yes, maybe I didn't have good spending habits, but the only way to get through it is to acknowledge it. If you've listened to any of the live launch episodes that we've done in the past, we go through a whole filing system where you can feng shui your finances and get everything in order. Sometimes that's the first step so that you can now acknowledge the existence of these things. And unless you're acknowledging it and making a plan for it, it's hard to get through them. So just lay everything out on your current financial status, because once you do that, then you can grow from there. But it's like anything. If you have a plan to lose weight or to exercise or any of those things, the first thing you want to do is take inventory of where you are now, because that's the best way to measure your future success. So a year later, you can look back and say, oh yeah, I had this credit card debt and I planned and was diligent every single year based on my plan. And a year or 2 years later, I paid that off and I don't have it anymore. And that can give your psyche a boost as well, and it's a win for you. And so looking at your current financial status is really important. There's a lot of information to help you get started as well. If you're not sure where to get started, you can always ask for help. One, because we always talk about our complimentary financial consultation that's always available to you, but there's also a lot of information available on how to track your net worth, getting an overview of credit and what that means, and a lot of different strategies on actually how to get out of credit card debt. These are things that you don't want to wing. You don't want to continue to wing it if you're still struggling with credit card balances and such. You want to put a plan together that you can actually stick to, and that's going to give you more confidence going forward. The third topic is financial goals for the future. So you want to discuss your long and short-term financial goals. This includes talking about your savings and spending goals as well, in addition to buying a house, retirement, investments, your insurances, and healthcare. And this is a good time to talk about whether you want kids if you don't already have them, and the finances relating to education and daycare. Deciding what you would do if a family member asks for financial assistance is another way to see if you're on the same page with your finances. These are really, really good topics to lay out initially, because then you can modify them as they change and as you grow and as your goals differ based on life experiences, but also the discussion about helping family with finances or friends with finances. Having those discussions before they come about will really help you get through these things in a much less stressful manner. When things come at you and there isn't a plan for it, especially with finances, it tends to bring up things, and it tends to be an emotional decision-making situation. Versus if you have a plan in place and you have goals that you're setting out, you can look and say, this family member or this friend needs help. How is that going to affect our current circumstances? Are we going to put ourselves in danger financially if we do something because someone else needs help? It's not because you don't want to, but you also have to look at your own circumstances so that you're not jeopardizing what you have in place. And again, this is a great topic to have with your kids as a family, so that everyone knows this is what we're looking to do as a family. This is what we can spend. This is our discretionary money to do other fun things like vacations and Disneyland and all those other things that come into play when you have a family. This is really a wonderful area and topic for our business owners, right? Because as a business owner, as an entrepreneur, you are hopefully also doing planning on the business side. And so you want to know and you want to see how to structure your available resources on your business side to help fund some of your personal long and short-term goals. And there are ways to do that with different retirement plans and group coverages and things of that nature. So as an entrepreneur, you have a lot of resources available to you that you may be unaware of. A lot of times my business clients and my entrepreneurs, they think they're more limited, and often will say, well, I don't have a 401k like my spouse does through work. And then I have shown them the variety of ways that they can transfer some of their business wealth to their personal wealth, getting a deduction on their business side and increasing their personal wealth without increasing your personal income tax at the same time. So these long and short-term goal discussions are really important when you have someone, a couple, let's say one is an employee, one's a business owner, and those are different arenas bringing money into the household. So how do you do that the most efficient way possible? You start out by looking at those short and long-term goals and then backing your way out of it to see what's the best way, what's the most efficient way that we can fund those goals, and what do we need to generate as a family or as a business owner to make those things happen. So these are all wonderful foundational discussions to have. And then when things come up, that you're coming from a proactive place versus a reactive place. And when you're looking at spending money, which is the number one thing that most long-term couples fight about, if you have your long and short-term goals in place, then those discussions become much easier because you're looking at why you're saving and investing. And this is a good time to bring this piece of the puzzle up from the Inc. article that I started out reading, is that the most common couple situation is a saver is usually with a spender. That's the most common couple combination. And the opposites attract, right, comes into play. So we have the opposites attract, a spender and a saver, and then they fight about it later on. So it's a really good idea, because just as the saver and investor has whys about why that's important to them, the spender, it doesn't mean they're spending frivolously necessarily, but there may be reasons why certain things are important to that person. So if we start looking at long and short-term goals and looking at in terms of why it's important to each of you and having a discussion about it, then these financial topics become easier and easier. And the question of should we spend money on this thing becomes much easier as well, because if we spend here, where will it affect our long and short-term goals? If it doesn't affect them negatively, then it's easier to spend those monies and not have stress around it. But if you're not having discussions around it and you're spending money without the discussion or how it's affecting everything else, that's where the stress comes into play. So hopefully you're getting the idea that the reason why I'm bringing these topics and breaking them down to this point is to show you how to bring them into the discussions in a non or minimize the stress around the initial discussions and topics. And let me just tell you though, if you do it from the standpoint of no judgment and talking about your values, and you do it more often, it gets easier and easier. So if you start to have the money talk with your significant other or your life partner, and you can see that it's causing immediate like physical stress in their body, you can back up a little bit and say, well, why don't we just talk about our values? Like what's important about money to each of us, and start the discussion that way, and then lean into it with some of the other topics. So just remembering, it's always good to create a relaxing environment as well, versus having something happen and then come from a very emotional approach to the situation, especially if you're upset. That usually never goes well, especially with the money topic. So another topic, topic number 4, is bank accounts, joint, separate, or both, right? You have to decide how you want to combine your lives financially. The traditional way of combining finances is to have all monies go into one account, but the more modern approach is for each person to have a separate account, for there to be one joint account for all the joint expenses. Whichever method you choose, and there are several, there's everything in between that spectrum. Just remember that separate doesn't mean hidden, right? So even if you and your partner have separate accounts, there should be transparency when it comes to those accounts. So it's not hiding to have separate, it's just people may deal with money differently. I have seen dozens of different approaches, including an approach where there is a large difference between the two income earners. So maybe one income earner earns 150,000 a year and the other person earns 50,000 a year. I've seen the approach where they've taken a fraction or a percentage based on their income. So the person that makes 50,000 a year maybe only pays 25% of all the expenses from the income, and the person that makes 150 pays for 75% and makes it a little bit more attainable for everybody to feel like they're contributing their fair share. There are other approaches where the person that's making 150,000, they want to live on that, and then they use the second income of 50,000 as their investments, and so they'll use that entire salary to go towards their long and short-term goals, their savings and investing, and then they work that way. So there are a lot of different approaches. The key is having the discussions and figuring out what feels good to each of you, and then work a plan around that. And here's the other good thing is a lot of times people will get very frustrated because they'll try to work a plan that didn't make sense over the long term, and you forget that you can actually change the plan anytime that you want. So if something isn't working, modify it, but don't let it get and create additional stress in your financial situation or in your home. You can hopefully come to your person and say, I know we started doing this, but this is how it's feeling to me, right? It's not, oh, you made us do it this way and it's not working. I always encourage my clients to come from the approach is, how does it make you feel? And let's work from there, modify what you're doing and find something that actually works for you. There are so many approaches, it's just finding the right one. And usually it's not the first one that you start out with. It can be, but again, knowing that you can modify what you're doing by having the discussion before it becomes stressful, then you can make different choices based on what everyone is feeling, what feels better to each of you, and going forward. Okay, so this is something that we talk about almost every focus on finances, is creating your spending plan, right? So decide how you want to budget together. Have budgeting meetings together, either monthly or weekly in the beginning, and then you can spread them out once you have a system in place. The first step is to start out listing all of your expenses. You can use all your bank and year-end credit card statements to help figure out your monthly averages. And again, as we talked last week, this is the perfect time to do it because you have all of your year-end for December 31st, 2020 to help map out all these different expenses that you have and create your spending plan. Right? Your spending plan can be the tool that you use to create a plan with your partner. It can make your financial goals possible because it can be the roadmap by which you actually achieve them. I love my spending plan because it allows me to accomplish my financial goals. It can also help you pay off student loans and other debts if you have them. So if you incorporate all of those things into your spending plan, you can actually see where the money's going. And this is really important when you have two people in the household and maybe you spend on different things. If you can combine your spending plans and see how that's affecting things in a positive or negative way, then again, you can make those adjustments. But if you don't know what one person's spending and what the other person's saving, then it kind of is that mismatch of knowing all the facts and making choices based on all the facts versus partial information. Number 6 is a biggie to me, and the topic is decide who is in charge. Determine who will handle day-to-day finances like budgeting and bills, and who will be in charge of long-term finances. Maybe a rotating schedule will work for you. That would be probably the lesser common of all of their approaches, but maybe one of you is much better at being organized and keeping track of things. The point is to decide proactively who is going to manage the money. If both of you manage your finances together, then set up times where you go over your finances to make sure you're on the same page. This is an area that's really critical. And I will share with you also, especially again coming from the entrepreneurial side of things, in my past relationships, I made the mistake of assuming that we both dealt with money the same way. And honestly, as well, and I'm bringing this up with my business owners and entrepreneurs a lot today because most of us feel like, well, we run a business, we should be able to deal with our finances. I'm lucky in this way because my business is dealing with finances, so they go hand in hand. But as I talk to my other entrepreneurs, including my marketing person, we just had this discussion last month, running a business or whatever your expertise is, it's a different skill set than dealing with your finances. And here's something that I also want to bring up in this topic as well, is that many times my entrepreneurs are working very hard, long days. You get home, if you're a mom and you have kids and you're doing homework and you're making dinners and you're getting lunches ready for the next day at school and making sure they're on track, at the end of the day, let's face it, you're a little exhausted, right? Understandably. And many times Again, I'm lucky I get to deal with finances throughout the day, so I can fold my business and my finances into my day. Most people don't have that luxury because you're doing your job, you're doing your business. Most of the time, it's not in finance. Then you're going home and you're managing your home. And then you're in a relationship, so you want time for your relationship. And honestly, what happens is that the financial stuff is set aside for another day, and then another day, and then another day. I just had a discussion with one of my clients today who's got a very high demanding job, and we are waiting for paperwork from her, and we're just checking in just to make sure there weren't any questions. And the email back was, I've just been so slammed. By the time I get home to look at the paperwork, I'm pretty exhausted. So this is a very common scenario, especially for my women entrepreneur clients, because you're handling so much. You have so much decision making going on. And honestly, by the time you get to the financial part, you're pretty much on overload. And so a lot of times that piece gets set aside. And again, my job when I'm working with my clients is to make sure that not too much time passes by, because next thing you know, it's 6 months later and we still haven't put the plan in place. So those delays, the procrastination, sometimes it's not because you don't want to deal with it, but you're just frankly too tired to deal with it. So when you're looking at who's in charge, right? There may be a system that you can combine, but make sure that you're both on the same page. Because in my situation with my past relationship, we weren't on the same page. I was the investor saver and I had my own business. So I was working, they were doing the day to days, but that was not their skill set. And we didn't talk about it. And because we didn't talk about it, I was going on the assumption that we dealt with things in the same way, and not better or worse, just different. We had different values around money. We had different concepts of how money should be dealt with. And we didn't talk necessarily on a regular basis about short term goals. Long term goals were more of the conversation, but short term goals are critically important to talk about because they can, in fact, keep you from getting to your long-term goals if you're constantly being reactive to things to make the short-term goals work. So deciding who's in charge doesn't necessarily mean that can't be changed, but knowing who's dealing with the day-to-day, who's dealing with the management of the long term, and if no one wants to do it, then that really is kind of a sign that you need to ask for help and work with someone that you trust and is on the same page with you. And hopefully, because I do with my clients, they're asking you, what are your long and short-term goals? What is your spending plan? It's the one thing that most of my clients, or people coming into being my client, it's the one thing that they don't like to do. But once it's done, everything else, because that's the foundation piece, everything else starts to fall into place. And it's hard to modify. It's hard for an advisor to modify something that we can't see. So if you have goals and I don't have a spending plan, I don't know if it's realistic for you to implement those goals and make them happen. If I see what you're doing, regardless of what it is, we can work from there. So it's really important that you decide. One person just may not want to deal with the finances at all. And if that's the case, then the other person hopefully feels comfortable and confident. If you don't, again, that's where seeking help will help you in the long run, because I honestly have had couples come in where they're in the situation where my business entrepreneur, he's been handling the business, he's been handling all the finances, and his spouse didn't really have an interest in it. And he did not feel confident in any of the pieces of the puzzle, but I was asking him about what was important to him. You know, what kinds of things is he wanting to do in life in regards to his money and the whys. I wanted to know his why. And this is a big guy. I mean, he owns a gym and he, is literally physically a big guy. And literally he broke down and cried because no one ever asked him what was important to him. He just felt like it was his duty to take care of all the finances. And honestly, being a business owner, he felt like he should be able to do that. But running a gym is different than running your financial business, right? Your finances is and should be considered a whole separate business in itself. And if you treat it as such, then it's going to give you a leg up in achieving all these things. So find out who's going to be in charge of what. If you're doing it together, wonderful. If there are areas that you need assistance in, that is a key indicator that you need to ask for help and have a starting place. So maybe the help is temporary just to get you on a system that you can actually do on your own. And maybe the help is my business owners are never going to have the amount of time that they want to do this efficiently and effectively. And the reality is for them, a lot of them are procrastinating putting things in place, which means they have less time to achieve the goals that they came in. So it's better for them. They can delegate that job to an advisor to help them keep them on track. So find out who needs to be in charge. If it's not you, get help and continue to discuss what's important to each of you. And you can always change that as you learn more about the financial ins and outs, taking care of not only your day-to-days, but your short and long-term savings and investing goals. And number 7, again, we're talking about communication, but number 7 is how much communication you both expect. This is critical as well. Communication in a relationship is paramount to most things, period, not just finances, but everything. So deciding how much to communicate about money is one way to be ahead of the curve. Do you need to tell the other person if you're spending a certain amount of money? Do you want to meet weekly to go over your budget? Do you want to have quarterly and yearly money evaluations? You don't need to do any of these things, but you do need to be on the same page as your partner. Having these discussions is the way to decide what will work best in your relationship. It will also help if and when you are fighting about money. And just let me tell you, when we look at some of these topics and you go through some of them, you'd be hard pressed to think that you would have more arguments versus less arguments about money. And who doesn't want less arguments about anything, right? But especially money, since it is the most common thing the long-term couples talk about. And, as a final note, just remembering trust is the foundation on which relationships are built. And whether you like it or not, you will have to use money in your relationship, whether you have a little bit or a lot or somewhere in between. So having these money conversations with your partner now will help you create a plan as a team. And when you do that, you can work together and look at things from a proactive versus reactive approach. So I hope this helps. I hope this kind of brings into focus, especially with my entrepreneurs out there who struggle with time, right? If you're struggling with time, then you need to look at delegating this piece of your financial puzzle out. And if you can do that with your significant other and bring in all the business resources that you have available to you and map that out so it is congruent with what you want to do in your household, then you're going to have a much stronger sense of what you're doing. And when you have less financial stress, I know we like to try and compartmentalize. My entrepreneurs, we think we can compartmentalize our entrepreneur life outside the home and our family life inside the home, but the reality is that they do overlap. So if you're struggling or having a hard time with something at work, it would be highly unusual for that not to affect your home life at all, especially if it has to deal with money and finances, and vice versa. If you're having struggles and stresses around finances in your home, it would be hard pressed to say that's not going to affect how you operate and how you show up in business, because you might be putting more pressure on yourself to do more or to do better, versus looking at what is the stressor and how can we develop a plan and implement a plan to resolve it. So I hope this was helpful. I hope everyone has an amazing Friday, a terrific weekend, and I look forward to seeing you next week on Friday's Focus on Finances. Bye, everybody.